you so much, Dr. Mann. I am going to start by sharing. And as I share my screen, I do want to highlight, and that's showing up, correct?
Yes, we've got a tab
Okay.
on the left side that's a box that says,
Sorry, there you go.
yeah, there you go. And then
Okay.
then it looks good.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I do want this to be a conversation, and I kind of view the time that I have and the slides that I prepared as a time for sort of setting the groundwork and the foundation for a conversation. So I just wanted to highlight that. So I just want to say thank you, and it really is a deep honor to facilitate this discussion today. We should be celebrating very soon the 50th anniversary of Roe v. Wade. Instead, we're experiencing a critical moment, a juncture of crisis and guarantees to rights and dignity. I spent much of my life focusing on discussing, understanding, and supporting access to abortion. As Dr. Mann mentioned in the introduction, I worked for IPAS for many years, mainly in Latin America and African countries. For 5 years while living in Mexico City, I collaborated with an alliance in Mexico that contributed to the legalization of abortion in Mexico City. And all of these experiences have shaped who I am and how I work. I arrived in South Carolina in 2007 and immediately jumped into activism and research just because that's who I am, and focusing a lot of time to participate in a statewide coalition, including being very present and speaking out at legislative hearings over the years that aim to restrict abortion access in our state. 2022 was definitely the hardest year ever, at least in my experience. And I was told when I arrived here that, you're in South Carolina, you can't talk about abortion. My response was always, but it's legal in our entire country, and we have to talk about it. And that's what we need to do. That's what we've always needed to do, and that's what we need to continue to do. So that's one of the big take-home messages already. Okay. So before we begin, I wanted to acknowledge the life of our colleague, Professor Drew Barker. Drew was supposed to be here today. A few weeks ago, I discussed this really wonderful opportunity with her, and she expressed excitement about the talk and knew that afterwards I'd seek her feedback. I was really looking forward to that. Drew was committed to the issues we'll discuss today. She, like so many of us, was horrified by the paths being taken by the US Supreme Court and state legislatures. Her comments at the close of a 2019 interview for the collection on second wave feminism by Professor Andrea Lomendieu made clear her perspectives. And I'm happy to share this PowerPoint afterward, but you can see there's a hyperlink connected with Drew's name where you could actually listen to that interview. So I'd like to dedicate today's talk to Dr. Barker. So in the almost 7 months after the Dobbs decision, after the Supreme Court overruled on June 24th, 2022, that states may regulate abortion for, quote, legitimate reasons. Our current situation is that the authority to regulate abortion is, once again, quote, returned to the people and their elected representatives. Remember that phrase, returned to the people, because this is going to be one of the lessons from global experiences, as well as some local here in the US that we need to come back to. So where does this take us? Dr. Palacio from the Guttmacher Institute, she's the president and CEO, today made a statement saying on what would have been Roe's 50th anniversary, we're instead facing the deepest crisis in abortion access in 50 years. Abortion is now unavailable in 14 states, and that list will continue to grow. Already, some almost 18 million women of reproductive age, almost a quarter of the US total, now live in a state without a single abortion provider. Women, along with transgender and non-binary individuals who may need an abortion, are now forced to travel potentially vast distances to another state to get care, self-manage their abortion, and face possible legal prosecution, or accept the health risks and other wide-ranging consequences of carrying an unwanted pregnancy to term. So I wanted to highlight her words. According to the organization Pregnancy Justice, which was formerly known as National Advocates for Pregnant Women, the loss of Roe exacerbates racial, gender, economic, educational, and health disparities. The loss of Roe means the loss of bodily autonomy. The loss of Roe means more people will face pregnancy-related criminalization. We can look to the larger global context for insights about where the US is headed. In a lot of the statements that I've made in the legislature and on the state capitol steps and rallies and such, I've always brought this into my statements. So some of you might be tired of hearing me talk about this, but I'm going to emphasize it again. We can always look to the larger global context to understand where the US has been headed. We said it when there was the threat of Roe being overturned. We said it here in South Carolina as more and more draconian measures were taken and tried and included in bills. And so I'm really thankful for the opportunity to foster this discussion today, precisely about what we can learn from experiences around the world, both in terms of the implications for the legislative paths being taken, but also in terms of resistance through grounded activism. The fall of Roe really compels us to learn from the larger global context. So I am going to start with looking at legislation. It's not the only realm, but I want to start here because it is where we are largely focused right now in many ways, with a very confusing legislative landscape post-Roe that is changing every single day. This morning, I listened to a podcast with Mary Ziegler with Terry Gross on Fresh Air. Mary Ziegler is a professor of law at UC Davis, and she's written extensively about the cultural, legal, and political battles about abortion in the US. And she said, we're at a moment of almost unprecedented uncertainty in the US when it comes to abortion. I also want to start with legislation because there's a tendency to focus exclusively on legislation as like the realm of abortion action or action that will guarantee or deny abortion access. And I hope by the end of today's talk, we'll see that it's important, but it cannot be an exclusive focus. All right, so I want to start there. The challenge in this talk is that there is so much information, which is really exciting. So I admit I am skimming the surface here with the goal of, again, providing us with some information to foster discussion. So abortion is a common health intervention, and note that I said health intervention. 6 out of 10 of all unintended pregnancies end in an induced abortion around the world. Around 45% of all abortions are unsafe, or here least safe, and I'll define what that means in a second. And most of those, about 97%, happen in the global South, at least right now. Unsafe, or what World Health Organization is now calling least safe, is a leading but preventable cause of maternal deaths and morbidities. And when we look at the US situation, in terms of maternal mortality, those of you who know the statistics know, just at a general level, we have among the worst statistics in the global North, in the so-called developed countries, in the high income countries. And so banning abortion will lead to increasing maternal mortality and morbidity due to a cause that is 100% preventable. So lack of access to safe, timely, affordable, and respectful abortion care is a critical public health, and it's a human rights issue. So one of the messages, legally restricting abortion, meaning a full-out ban or only allowing procedures to take place to save the woman's life or for physical health, does make abortion less safe. In other words, offering abortion without restrictions makes it significantly safer than restricting abortion. And yet trends in the US are for full out or major restrictions. So you can see here in this table, the last row is highlighted And the major point here is that in countries, and the N here for this particular study was 57 countries, where abortion is offered without restriction, women don't, or pregnant people do not need to provide a reason. 87% of abortions that take place in those settings are safe versus 0.7% least safe. And the least safe is really about, this is a World Health Organization definition. Those are abortions that were provided by untrained individuals using dangerous methods, such as caustic substances, foreign bodies, or traditional kinds of concoctions. We are not talking here about the use of, and we'll talk about this in a bit, but medication abortion, the mifepristone and misoprostol, which falls into the classification of a safe abortion. Number two, since 1994, nearly 60 countries have liberalized their abortion laws. It's made it, countries have taken action to make abortion more legal. Let's put it that way. But 4 have removed legal grounds for abortion: the United States, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Poland. And these data are according to the Center for Reproductive Rights. Since 2000, 38 countries have changed their abortion laws, and all but 1, Nicaragua, expanded the legal grounds on which women can access abortion services. Since 2020, Argentina and Thailand have legalized abortions with certain gestational limits. Mexico decriminalized abortion, as did South Korea, and New Zealand eased its abortion restrictions. Most recently, or more recently, Colombia, the country, made abortion legal on demand up to 24 weeks of pregnancy. So pretty striking graphic here that we are headed in the wrong direction. I want to point out here the issue, the broad issue of legalization and decriminalization. And let me just, have a parenthetical comment here that these terms are used sometimes interchangeably. They're not exactly the same. When we talk about legalizing abortion, we're talking about keeping abortion within legal statutes in some form, but identifying grounds on which it's allowed. Decriminalizing actually removes criminal sanctions. The act that was previously defined as a crime is no longer treatable as a criminal offense. So I want to put out those definitions because the difference is important as you're kind of, and if you're interested, in digging in deeper, you will see these different terms being used. In Canada, in 1988, the Supreme Court struck down a law limiting the access to the case of risk to the mother's life, that's their terminology, declaring it as unconstitutional as the law violated a woman's right to life, liberty, and security of person. And to date, Canada is the only country that's completely decriminalized abortion, meaning taken it out of the criminal code, the legal code, and it is fully within sort of the realm of healthcare and public health. In 2021, Mexico decriminalized abortion through a Supreme Court ruling stating that in 2021, based on self-determination, and that the Constitution of Mexico, and stating that criminalizing abortion is unconstitutional. In South Korea, the Constitutional Court in 2019 decriminalized abortion based on self-determination, and the Constitution also guarantees, quote, human worth and dignity and the pursuit to happiness. And in Argentina in 2020, abortion was legalized. So the reason I want to emphasize this is, once again, here are examples of countries where the Supreme Court has ruled in favor of increasing abortion access, decriminalizing it, legalizing it, based on frameworks of human rights. You won't see in any of these examples that I just gave or other examples the issue of privacy being first and foremost. Again, just to highlight a bit more about the Supreme Court decision in Mexico, the basis was jurisprudence that the constitutional right to health includes freedoms and entitlements. And those freedoms include the freedom to decide regarding one's own personal health outcomes and the risks that they're willing to take, as well as entitlements to medical assessment and free abortion services, both to be provided by healthcare, public sector healthcare facilities. This decision by the Supreme Court considers, when we look at human rights frameworks and human rights in general, you have to consider the indivisibility and interdependence of human rights. So in this case, really highlighting not the right to health, the right to life, the right to non-discrimination on the basis of gender, the right to privacy, that's in there. I highlighted that because that is the real basis of ruling, the Roe v. Wade ruling in the United States. And that was sort of the only thing that we've had to hang on to. In Mexico City, they also look at the right to personal integrity and the right to autonomy. And those rights are enshrined in the Mexican Constitution, as well as treaties that have been ratified in Mexico. Here's the big point. Wouldn't it be great to use these human rights frameworks in the United States as well? Here's the catch. The United States has not ratified any international human rights treaties since December of 2002, when it ratified 2 optional protocols to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So unfortunately, and I can use other words as well, for example, the United States has not ratified. It's one of only 7 countries that has failed to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, otherwise known as CEDAW. And CEDAW, being ratified in so many other countries, including Mexico, is once again what activists have used, what the legal activists, as well as other kinds of activists, have used, not just for pushing forward these kinds of decisions in Mexico about increasing access to abortion, but also the intersection with other human rights issues affecting indigenous people, particularly in the Mexican context, low-income people, people who are marginalized and have challenges really accessing their rights. So that is a set of tools that we do not have in the United States. And just kind of, highlighting that as a real deficit in our country. Okay, another message is that abortion bans open opportunities to use homicide laws. Activists must not only focus here in the US only on proposed penalties in abortion laws. So examples here include Mexico, El Salvador, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, where studies have been done that have shown that restrictive abortion laws result in a social and political climate that has stigmatized abortion and allows for people to be incarcerated under the suspicion of having aborted a pregnancy and then being charged with homicide with penalties of 30 to 40 years. You can see on this slide in Mexico, back in 2016, a number of us created the documentary called Las Libres, and this was done with the support of IPAS, to show the ways in which this had been taking place over time, and where laws were used, and women, quite honestly, were targeted and trapped in many situations. And you can hear their testimonies in this documentary. But targeting low-income women, indigenous women, there are some women who spoke out in the documentary who are indigenous, whose Spanish is very limited, who were not given interpretation services. And so that has been a huge problem. Now, Las Libres, a Mexican organization that I'll talk about in a few minutes, worked with pro bono, with lawyers who worked pro bono, and the film ends with women being released from prison, but after having served years in prison, not being charged with abortion, but being charged with aggravated homicide or attempted homicide of a family member. And although the women were freed, it's still technically on their record that they have committed a crime. In El Salvador, the Teodora Vasquez is one of the women who she gave birth to a stillborn baby, but she was charged with aggravated homicide, and she served 10 years of a 30-year prison sentence. El Salvador is a particularly egregious case. In 1998, it goes all the way back to 1998, when El Salvador changed its abortion law to be among the most draconian in the United States, in the world, and their laws do not meet international human rights obligations. Life from the moment of conception has been enshrined in El Salvador's national constitution, and abortion is illegal in all circumstances, even in cases of rape, incest, when a woman's life or health is at risk, or in cases of severe and fatal fetal impairment. Women with ectopic pregnancies have been denied care until their fallopian tubes explode, and then they can get care to save their lives. But that simple medication, methotrexate, that can stop an ectopic pregnancy while in the fallopian tubes, is not allowed to be used in El Salvador. So you might say, oh, that's horrible. Oh my gosh, that's so shocking. We would never have that. I invite all of you, I was there in person, I invite all of you to go back and look at some of the special committee meetings and the Senate Medical Affairs Committee meeting last summer here in South Carolina, where legislators such as Senator Richard Cash in South Carolina proposed the same sorts of restrictions, a full-out ban on abortion. Since 1998, at least 182 women with an obstetric emergency have been prosecuted for abortion or aggravated homicide in El Salvador. And all the way up to June of 2022, a court sentenced a woman who suffered an obstetric emergency to 50 years in prison for aggravated homicide. So lots of other examples. Right now in the United States, in El Salvador, you also cannot help a pregnant person obtain an abortion. And that is something that we need to be looking out for. Right now, there are many states that are proposing that only people who are performing the abortions or people who are, quote, aiding and abetting, right, that abortion process will face penalties. But pregnant people, I guarantee you, are next. But the bigger point in this particular slide is the ways in which homicide laws are used versus the actual abortion legislation to punish people who are pregnant and either have an induced abortion, have an ectopic pregnancy, have a miscarriage, have some sort of obstetric emergency. All right, so I want to highlight as well in this legal context the power of the vote, the referendum. We know that around the world, including here in the US, that people do not want full bans when they understand the implications. The referendum in Ireland in 2018 repealed the 8th Amendment of the Irish Constitution, which did ban abortion. And so now it's legal, abortion is legal in Ireland within the first 12 weeks without restriction. We saw in Kansas in 2022, a referendum being held that the vote overwhelmingly rejected a Kansas constitutional amendment that would have declared the Kansas Constitution would not guarantee the right to an abortion. That was defeated, and there are other ballot measures that took place in the US in 2022, including California, Kentucky, Michigan, Montana, and Vermont. And this is something that we have proposed here in South Carolina. It has not been taken up. We are absolutely positive, giving some polling that's been done and such, that if it were brought to a referendum here in South Carolina and many other states, that people would not vote for a complete ban. Okay, looking at global experiences and using global guidance. The World Health Organization has been working for decades on global guidance for ethical, dignified, high quality abortion care. And these guidelines and recommendations based on best practices, based on global research and experience, is something that I think in the US, people in health systems, activists, the legal field, et cetera, have got to hit that hyperlink and read this abortion care guideline. It has provided the guidance for countries around the world. Why not the US as well? And I think it will also raise awareness about, once again, how other countries are working so hard to implement this kind of guidance. And in the US, we are headed in a completely a different direction. Dismantling stigma is incredibly important. Abortion stigma plays a critical role in the social, medical, and legal marginalization of abortion care around the world, and it leads to negative outcomes for anyone seeking abortion care, but also those providing abortion care. And here I wanted to highlight a toolkit that was developed over many, many years by and lots of experience by colleagues at IPAS, really tapping into deep literature about stigma overall and looking at how it relates to abortion in terms of labeling, stereotyping, separating, and then ultimately discriminating. And when we get to the issue of discrimination, that takes us back to the legal realm, right? And legal sort of frameworks that ban discrimination based on gender, for example. So this is another tool that we can be using. And I want to highlight in this toolkit, Module 5 really looks at intersectionality, which is a huge issue here where abortion stigma and other stigmas join forces. Let's now shift to some of the good news, right? Globally, IPAS in its work through on abortion stigma worked with colleagues over many years. One of the results with was an effort called Inroads, which is now an independent nonprofit, the International Network for the Reduction of Abortion Discrimination and Stigma. And this is one of the most dynamic, exciting collaborations, coalitions, networks around. And yet there's very little presence of US-based activists in Inroads. So my shout out is join Inroads, where their main statement is, we firmly believe in the transformational power of our diverse community, leading vital work to create a world free of abortion stigma. After all, real change only manifests through our collective brilliance and power. And their 2021 report is not just beautiful and stunning in its graphics, but also in the richness of the lessons that it provides here. I'm not going to go through all of this. I just want to highlight the diversity of sort of strategies that are being developed, a lot of times by grassroots organizations with very little funding. Things like capacity building for traditional birth attendants in Zambia, developing and testing an abortion stigma scale in Cameroon, care for pilot project to use TikTok to communicate abortion with youth by in Thailand. And and Inroads, the partnership, has seed grants that will continue to support some of this work. And just take a look at their website. You will just be absolutely amazed at the richness of experiences being developed. In terms of global experiences, also creating symbols and language that resonate with local experiences. I am picking this example of civilism and history that shifted to real power, looking at the green scarf, the green wave, that started in Argentina. And one might say, oh, wow, okay, well, that's an upbeat color, or, how did the green color come about? It's in an article a new article by a young researcher, Macon. She says that the connection to Argentina's past with the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo and women coming out to demand justice for their mainly sons and daughters who were disappeared during the military dictatorship in Argentina, really has connected with the struggles for legalizing abortion in Argentina. And so the scarf, it changed color, but it was really tapping into a decades-long, very powerful grassroots, women-led kind of activism that taps into the experience of military dictatorship and repression in Argentina. A senator in 2020 during the vote in Argentina said forcing a pregnant person to give birth is a violation, once again, of human rights, right? Bringing in the human rights discourse and conducting an unwanted pregnancy is torture. So sorry, I just want to go back to this for a second. So one of the questions for us in the US is, what is our history? What is our set of symbols, our links to the past? And do we need to join the green wave or separate ourselves from what is becoming at least a regional movement? And I'm always, those of you who know me, I'm always advocating that we join forces with this really powerful movement. Global experiences of claiming our own lives and bodies. I'll just highlight here the issue of accompaniment. And again, I've embedded a video. This is a documentary that a number of us made with the support of IPASS with Las Libres a number of years ago about the issue of accompaniment and how to accompany someone through an abortion process. The context of this, I'll just say quickly, is that this documentary took place at a time when abortion still was not decriminalized in Mexico. And yet a group of people said, we've got to make sure that people have access to safe abortion services. The drug misoprostol was available over the counter. I'll just shift to that. And misoprostol is labeled as an ulcer medication. And a prescription is not needed in many countries. It is needed here in the United States. And so Las Libres really started accompanying women by getting the over-the-counter misoprostol, teaching them how to use it, accompanying them through the process. And that documentary shows you the steps of how that took place, but also the impact in, once again, dismantling stigma and building a social movement that is not only strong in the state of Guanajuato and in Mexico overall, but really has spread to all over Latin America and into the United States. This is the connection between what's happening in Mexico through accompaniment and offering people the opportunity to use misoprostol with mifepristone without a prescription is something that has been highlighted in the New York Times. I put the link at the bottom of the page, and that we can talk about. Okay, lastly, connection, communication, and strategizing. I wanted to highlight here that there are efforts right now going on to link US legislators with what's happening in Latin America. Representative Cindy Polo from Florida, she has gone to El Salvador to visit women in prison for abortion charges. At a larger level, the organization, the State Innovation Exchange, or SIX, the Reproductive Freedom Leadership Council, has made visits to Mexico and El Salvador, visiting Mexico to see what the advances are that should be made, and visiting El Salvador to really see, not just hear from people like myself, but to hear directly from women who have either been are no longer incarcerated, or are still incarcerated, to find out firsthand what happens when total bans are in place. And I can show some of this, but I'd rather have some discussion here, but the resources is available to everyone here. Okay, so I just want to end with some core lessons. This is just a sampling. Legislative restrictions do not work. If the aim is to stop people from having abortions, that is often not the aim. Exceptions to legislative restrictions do not work. I didn't get into the details there, but if the aim is to have access to services under certain conditions, we have seen time and time again that exceptions do not get put into practice. Why? Because of fear, misinformation, misunderstanding of existing laws, stigma. The issue of, do we continue to focus on privacy alone, or do we expand whether or not the US signs global treaties, right? Do we as activists, researchers, et cetera, expand to use a human rights framework in everything that we do? I would advocate, I would say yes. We have to address abortion-related stigma at multiple levels. Self-managed abortion must be considered, and we can talk about what that means. And activism really has to be intersectional. It has to include, but also go beyond legislative efforts. It also has to include and focus on abortion, but it has to go beyond that. It has to, we've got to, and again, using a South Carolina example, I think that we've been through one of the coalitions quite effective in the past few years in recognizing we can't just focus on the abortion issue alone, and have brought in lots of different organizations and working on that intersectionality of, if abortion is banned, contraception limitations or perhaps bans comes next. It affects the rights and freedoms of LGBTQ individuals. And so that sort of domino effect, or it's not even a domino effect, the interrelatedness of abortion bans with so many other issues is something that we have to make quite explicit. Okay, so I am going to stop sharing now. I have said a lot, and ready for questions. And I'm sorry it got a bit dark in my space. I'm going to step away for just 1 second so I can turn on my lights. Sorry about that. Okay, I am back. So, discussion. Questions, comments, anything. And feel free to put something in the chat or raise your hand.
So we had a question in the chat about sharing the slides. I don't know if you can see the chat.
Yes, I can see it now. Yeah, very happy to share the slides. In fact, I would love that, so that you could really access those video links and the other resources that I put in there. So Renee asked, our state Supreme Court overturned the 6-week ban, correct? How will that impact future attempts to ban abortion? So yes, I won't go into the long story, but it's very interesting that in South Carolina, the state constitution was changed in 1971 to incorporate an amendment about guaranteeing the right to privacy. That now has come back, and Planned Parenthood, Center for Reproductive Rights, and others brought the 6-week ban to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court just ruled that, yes, on the basis of privacy, that 6-week ban is unconstitutional. And so right now we are back to abortion being legal up to 20 weeks. Now, it would be lovely if that meant, oh, no more bans could be implemented. That is not what it means. And I know that the 2023 legislative session is going to be chock full of many, let's say, creative attempts to ban abortion in many different ways. So I would just, my short answer to this, because there are some things happening in the chat. My short answer to this is please get on some listservs, get on, stay informed about the bills coming up in South Carolina. Read them. Don't just look at the title. Read them in full, because the nuances of the legislation are what we need to pay attention to. Last year, I sat with several legislators and took them through line by line what it said, what the implications are, what the global evidence says. And they, quite honestly, had no idea. They were thankful for that information, but they had no idea. So if we're not reading the legislation, sometimes our own allies are in the legislature are not reading the legislation. So we've got this, conversation that has to continue. Okay. Has the overturning of Roe opened the door to banning of contraceptives? Do you see this happening in the future? I see, and I would love to hear from other people. I'm not, the only voice on this. I absolutely think when you listen to the most conservative legislators in the South Carolina, in the House and the Senate, they will consistently deny that no, this is not going to affect contraceptives. This is not going to affect contraceptives. But we know you have to use logic. If something is written in a certain way in a law that says, which they attempted to do, that says life begins at the moment of fertilization, and there are certain contraceptives that potentially interfere with fertilization. I mean, the legal/logical conclusion of that is that those particular contraceptives are going to be banned. They also argue that IVF is not going to be affected, and every IVF physician and clinic director that has testified has said time and time again, that is impossible. We absolutely will be affected. We cannot not be affected by a law that defines life beginning at the moment of fertilization. Someone asked, do we need to start a referendum effort? I personally think that that's a fabulous idea. I think that as many efforts as possible to make our voices heard, for the most part, people in the United States, they're not supportive of full bans. Most people are also not supportive of full decriminalization. They're somewhere in between, okay? Let those voices be heard. Because I guarantee you, seeing what we've seen in South Carolina and other states, the real effort is in many places to continue to work toward full banning of abortion. I just want to add here a little, note of self-criticism personally, and in terms of thinking about movements in the United States. I think we depended on Roe v. Wade being there way too much. We knew the Center for Reproductive Rights was doing this analysis, and Guttmacher was doing this analysis years ago. If Roe were to fall, these states still have abortion restrictions on the books, right? And there were a number of states, I mean, going back decades and decades, right? We did not have a concerted effort to overturn those state laws. And part of the decades-long movement to getting to where we are today was the chipping away state by state, imposing more restrictions. And there's a whole kind of listing we could go through that differs from state to state, but also knowing that we were not working strategically to at the same time overturn those bans that went into place as soon as Roe v. Wade was overturned.
Debbie,
yes.
Allison is driving, so she can't type in the chat. So I'm going to try to unmute her. Ooh. Maybe Rebecca can do that.
Hi.
Yeah, perfect.
Hey, Allison.
Hey, and now I'm going to have a coughing fit. So sorry about that. I was telling my colleague Catherine, excuse me, how you always manage to sort of scare the shit out of me.
Sorry.
And so I kind of wonder, if you'll just talk a little bit about, I know this is totally my job, but I kind of need the juice right now. If you'll just kind of talk about the hope and the work and the women that have like been doing this for so long. I can't, like, when I hear about any pregnant person going to jail for their pregnancy outcome, it just like scares the bejesus out of me. And I don't know how we continue to fight this when that looms. And I know that's kind of like the terror that they want to instill in us.
Yes,
Can
exactly.
you talk a little bit about that? Thank
Yeah,
you.
yeah, no, Allison, that's such a great point. And I mean, I think, you know, going back to those slides about what Inroads is doing, what movements are doing all over the world, I'm most familiar with what's happening in Latin America, right? I mean, it's a matter of continuing to be energized, to strategize, to keep that energy up. But I also feel like we can't, and we don't want to. Why would we want to do that in isolation? I feel like the United States, in so many ways, we love to isolate ourselves. We love to think that we're the exception, right? We're not part of the world, the rest of the world. We don't need to pay attention to treaties. We don't need to pay attention to actions. And when you look at that video that I embedded of legislators from the US going to Mexico, for example, listen to them, Allison. Go back to that video and listen to them. And I would play it if we had more time. They came back emboldened, understanding that there are strategies that we need to pursue, that yes, it's going to take time. It is going to take time. But we have this very beautiful situation of sisters, colleagues, allies, friends, compañeras, you know, in Latin America, for example, who want to join forces with us. So I think a lot of it has to do with opening those conversations with them and just being energized by what they've learned, how they've done their work. I'm not saying that their strategies immediately translate into our strategies, but it's that hope, right? It's that energy. It's that we've been at this for a long time, and we have accomplished. It's celebrating the victories, celebrating the Supreme Court ruling, right? Celebrating the fact that so many of us continue to show up at the South Carolina legislature. More and more of us are, to say, you're not going to do this. Having researchers more and more focus their energies and resources on you know, studying and publishing about abortion. Part of the reason it was sort of challenging to put this together is there's just been this avalanche of information and energy. I think it's really, the situation that we're in right now has really, like, bing, you know, woken a lot of people up. And sometimes, unfortunately, as human beings, I feel like that's what we need. So yeah, so Allison, I would love to organize some spaces, some conversations with colleagues in different parts of the world. And there are lots of ways to do that. I think that would be very energizing. Let's see, I see Barbara Crane, yay, my colleague and friend from IPASS. Are there faith-based organizations and leaders involved in the struggle in South Carolina? Do you think they can be helpful? Yes, we need more. We definitely need more, but I would say, you know, I'm thinking back to and Allison, if you have feedback on this as well, but thinking back to the hearings that took place in South Carolina during the summer, where the legislators that organized those hearings, they thought, I don't know, maybe they thought we were all going on vacation or going to sleep or something, but we were there. There were a lot of us there, and they did not pass what they wanted to pass. And standing in line with people from, you know, leaders from faith-based organizations, from local congregations, as well as people themselves bringing their faith into the discussion. There were a number of testifiers who said, I'm Jewish. My faith does not talk about abortion in this way. And the kinds of restrictions that you are placing come from a completely different religious tradition. That is not my own. So I'm being, I'm feeling there's a pretty strong case for religious-based discrimination here. So those kinds of, and Barbara, I remember years ago sort of going to the State House, and the only person in a number of sessions that would consistently speak up was the pastor from the local Unitarian Universalist congregation. And that was important. That didn't quite cut it when one of the legislators said, "And what church are you from?" Right? But now that, not that the Unitarians are incredibly important in a state that is highly dominated by Christian denominations, and where the most vocal, I'm not saying everyone thinks this, but those that are coming to the hearings and are most vocal are of the fundamentalist Christian sort of, stream. There are more and more people from those faith-based communities that are speaking out, which is wonderful. Let's see, Rachel asks, what are specific things that we or our students can do to get involved in Columbia, South Carolina? I think that there are a lot of different things. If there's a group of us that started a kind of just meet, if we based it out of the School of Public Health, but anybody is welcome, really. It's a group that started talking, mainly students, and it's run by students who wanted to have conversations. They wanted to learn more. We watched the documentary about accompaniment, for example, and then had a conversation about accompaniment. Our first meeting brought in some lawyers, and as well as Ashley Lido from Wren. I would say get on Wren's mailing list for sure, because you'll be updated on everything that's happening. But the lawyers that spoke were very honest and sort of jokingly apologized to me afterward. And I said, you have nothing to apologize about. What they said to the students, what they said to all of us was, you can march, you can rally, you can protest. All of that is incredibly important. But if you don't understand how our legal systems work and how to work and weave in to those systems and make a difference there, if the only spaces we're occupying are outside of the State House in protests and marches and such, that gets good headlines. It's not going to make the impact that we need right now. So my shout out is, like, as many of you as can go to law school, the better. Sort of past that. If I had my life to do over again, I definitely would have gone to law school. But write to me, and we'll get you involved in this meeting. Also, Planned Parenthood and the Planned Parenthood student group on campus has been joining in these conversations. So it's a matter of, I don't think it's a matter of any one group doing it all. It's a matter of how do we sort of plant the seeds in lots of different spaces to get people to say, this, let's not even talk about, your moral sort of perspective or whatever. This is a public health issue, and this is a health issue. How do we talk about this issue in the School of Public Health, in public health classes, as a public health issue? I mean, the statistics that I showed you from the World Health Organization should be really compelling. How do we get this into coursework and talking about it in medical schools, in nursing schools, in sociology classes, just really everywhere? And Kathleen says, would love to know how to talk about abortion with my doctor too. Yeah, having the conversations, like role modeling the conversations that we need to be having with our doctors and healthcare providers in general, with our friends, with our family. The more we remain silent, right? We don't have to, if you're not comfortable sort of holding a sign or being in a rally, that's fine. How do you talk about this issue openly, honestly, without stigma, so that conversations can be had? Yeah, Allison, abortion is normal. It is normal. It is part of healthcare. But as long as we sort of whisper it under our breath or use, euphemisms to refer to it, we're doing ourselves a disservice. We really are. What want to be mindful of time. Oh, 2 minutes. Okay. Oh gosh, Allison says, I'm going to be training people to talk about abortion with their neighbors. I hope you'll join. Yay. Okay, Allison, make sure we get that invitation. There are national group, Renee says there are national Christian groups fighting to uphold abortion rights too. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but there are organizations and religion involved. Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And really sort of tapping into understanding what those organizations are doing is really, really important. Sandra asks, how best to frame the argument that the personal view of our legislators should not be the determining factor in his or her vote? We've got 1 minute left. I'll just say quickly, it's in part, those of us who are in Columbia have easy access to the State House. It's getting over there, going into that, through those doors, knocking on that legislator's doors or making an appointment, calling their legislative aides, calling the person that organizes the appointments in their office and talking to them and reminding them, you are my representative. If their phone is ringing off the hook, or the people that are coming into their office are the people that want the bans, and they are very good at that, those are the voices that they hear. And then they can come to the, legislative sessions and say, we're representing the people. I'm representing my people. I will just end with one example during the summer of a legislative hearing where it was a House hearing where Representative Neil Collins, he had voted for the 6-week ban. He went back to his, home and had a physician call him and say, because of that 6-week ban, there's a young woman who came to the hospital with complications. Our lawyers have advised us that we could not yet provide services for her. And she needed to come back when her health situation was more grave. Imagine that, you all. Imagine that situation. And they couldn't find her for a bit. She did ultimately come back and got the care that she needed. When Neil Collins was telling this story, and this hit the national press, probably the global press, he was in tears. He broke into tears. He said, I made this happen. I was responsible for making this happen. And he reminded legislators of the power that they have in these moments and the implications for people's lives. I think we need to remind them constantly of those kinds of realities. So I know I didn't get to everyone's comments, and I'm happy to stay on longer if other people want to stay on. I also want to be respectful of the time, and it's 6 o'clock.